begin with the latest allegations against Senate candidate Roy Moore. The only group with the power to force him out of the race, the Alabama Republican Party, met last night. And you would think this would be the moment, but they did not take up the issue. In fact, it never left the conversation phase. Then, Sean Hannity, who gave Moore 24 hours to explain himself before pulling his support back down after Moore wrote the Fox News host an open letter. Meanwhile, allegations against the Alabama Senate nominee Roy Moore continue to mount. AL.com is out with stories from two more women. Tina Johnson says she was 28 years old in 1991 when Moore groped her in his office. Kelly Harrison Thorpe says she was 17 years old when she turned down an overture from Moore in 1982. The New York Times and Washington Post are also out with front-page stories this morning from women who accuse Moore of going after teenage girls at the Gadsden Mall decades ago. Gina Richardson, who's on the right side in this picture, says it was right before or after her 18th birthday when she had her first encounter with Roy Moore. She was a senior in high school, working at Sears in 1977. She says after declining Moore's request for her phone number, he then called her school. She says she was pulled from math class to the principal's office, where Moore asked her out again over the phone. So she's standing in the principal's office, and he's asking her on a date?
Yep.
I said hello, Richardson recalls, and the male on the other line said, Gina, this is Roy Moore. I was like, what? He said, what are you doing? I said, I'm in trig class. Trigonometry? A few later, she says he asked again, and she relented. After going to a movie with him finally, she tells the Washington Post that they were in his car chatting and, quote, I just explained to him that my dad is a minister and, you know, I just can't sneak around because that's wrong. She says she thanked him and, quote, started to get out, and he grabbed me and pulled me in, and that's when he kissed me. And it was a man kiss, really deep tongue. It's 5 o'clock past the hour in the morning. Like, very forceful. It was a surprise. I'd never been kissed like that. She says she was scared and told him, quote, I've got to go because my curfew is now. She's a high school student. NBC News has not independently verified these allegations, and Moore has denied past allegations of sexual misconduct. The Moore campaign has called claims politically motivated. It's also fighting back at allegations from the only woman to accuse him of sexual assault, focusing on the part of the story involving his alleged signature in the woman's 1977 high school yearbook.
The allegations that have come out, I hope you understand, it takes time to work through this. We don't have a $20 million budget as a campaign. It takes time, and we want to be correct. We demand that you immediately release the yearbook to a neutral custodian so that our expert, you can send your expert as well if you'd like to, so that our expert can look at it, not a copy on the internet, the actual document, so that we can see the lettering, we can see the ink on the page, we can see the indentations, and we can see how old is that ink. Is it 40 years old, or is it a week old? Release the yearbook so that we can determine, is it genuine or is it a fraud?
Oh my God. Oh my
so,
God.
Heidi Prisbilla, that's the attorney for Roy Moore, talking about the signature in the yearbook that we discussed over the last couple of days. But the specific defense and actually the broad defense of Judge Moore comes in that Washington Post article about Gina Richardson, who was a high school senior working at Sears, when she says Judge Moore came in, hit on her, she refused to give his phone number, and then he called the office at her school, pulled her out of class, and asked her on a date. The defense in the Washington Post piece from the Moore campaign is this, quote, if you are a liberal and hate Judge Moore, apparently he groped you. So they disbelieve the claims. They say that the only reason and the only motive for anybody to come out and make them public now is to destroy his campaign, and they say it's a political farce. He's down in the polls. The latest poll has him down about 10, 12 points. Is he done? Is he going to survive this? How do you read it?
I think they're watching the polls very closely there in Alabama, because what else would explain why it's taken so long for the state party to do what the national party is doing up here in Washington, which is saying that this man has no place here in the Senate. Look, this is not just one woman who's come forward, one independent story. What we're seeing now is a similar pattern to what we saw in previous instances, like with Harvey Weinstein, like with Bill Cosby, where one woman comes forward, it gives other women the courage to come forward, and it starts to paint a narrative here where you had not just the women, but the entire community in this case, where you had people saying that he was showing up at the mall and that they were flagging him. So I think at some point, the leadership there in Alabama, the governor, yes, they are paying attention to these polls, and they are the only ones who have the power, not the national party, to call another election. And I think when it becomes clear to them that the results of this, of not taking some type of action, would by default mean that the Democrat wins, because even here you're splitting the ticket, and even if you disregard these polls, the Democrat would still have a better chance of winning.
And the Moore campaign is asking the public and voters and everyone to disbelieve a growing list of accusers now. And as you say, it's like Bill Cosby or Harvey Weinstein, where you say, how many women is it going to take for you to believe that that happened? Is it going to be 2, 5, 10, 50, 100? If it gets that way, as it did with some of these guys. As for the impact all this is having on the Senate race, NBC News has obtained a new poll from the National Republican Senatorial Committee that shows support for Roy Moore plummeting. The numbers show Democrat Doug Jones with a 12-point lead over Roy Moore among registered Alabama voters. Moore was leading by 9 points before the allegations. That's a 21-point swing in Jones's favor. Moore's favorability also tanking, down 16 points since these allegations were made public. We should note the NRSC is not sharing the entire poll or the name of the firm that conducted it.
It's hard to know.
The committee's chairman, Cory Gardner, already has called on Moore to be expelled from the race, and also expelled should he win the December 12th special election. Last night, Moore tweeted to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who's called for him to drop out of the race, to, quote, bring it on. Meanwhile, President Trump still has not addressed the Moore situation. Senator Lindsey Graham said that he's the head of the party, so, quote, it would probably be good if he said something. But yesterday, he did not.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all.
Should Roy Moore resign, Mr. President? Do you believe his accusers? Do you believe the accusers of Roy Moore, Mr. President? Should he resign?
So, Rick Tyler, the comment previously from Sarah Sanders speaking for the president was that, you know, if all these things are proven to be true, Roy Moore should get out of the race. There was a preface to that, though, that said, you know, we don't believe accusers without evidence. We don't believe them with fact. What is this doing to the party right now? And what are the long-term impacts to the party if Judge Moore is in fact elected, which he's slipping in the polls? If he becomes a member of the United States Senate, what does that mean?
It's a branding issue, because everybody in 2018 will say this is the party that elected child molesters.
It'll be like the party that wouldn't elect the rape guy, but decided for the sexual pervert who goes after children guy.
Yeah, Charlie Sykes said something yesterday I think is worth repeating. The Republican Party had a moment in last year when during the presidential primary, when the Access Hollywood tape came out, the party had a choice then to make a decision about the moral fitness of the president.
Right.
And so this is why, because here we are, and Roy Moore is in the exact same position as Donald Trump was, and he won't say anything about it because he doesn't have the moral standing to say anything about it, because he knows that he's vulnerable on this, and then we'll be talking about his accusers.
It's a part of a trend that we're seeing seeping inside the White House, judicial nominees, and people running for office, people who are unfit and morally completely off balance. I mean, there's nobody around the president at this point in the inner circle who isn't at some point either totally unequipped for the job or morally impacted, have taken some sort of strange oath. I mean, this is really frightening and a trend that could last for years, especially if this guy is elected. Now, you're covering Jeremy Peters, the Bannon angle. What is Steve Bannon's role in all of this?
He's not backing down, contrary to reports a couple of days ago that suggested he was somehow softening his support for Judge Moore. That is not the case, I'm told very reliably. Look, It's in Steve Bannon's interest that Roy Moore wins, because then it's more likely that Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans move to expel him. That will give Bannon and these conservative insurgents the civil war within the GOP that they are hoping for. And if they have that, if there's a move to expel a duly elected senator, then the debate shifts and it becomes less about defending somebody who is accused of sexually predatory behavior and more about overturning the will of the people. And this is something that even reasonable, moderate, middle of the road conservatives are really concerned about. You saw Susan Collins say the other day that she doesn't think that expulsion is something that should be taken lightly at all.
Not at all.
So Steve, think about the argument, as reported by Jeremy, that Steve Bannon is making, which is that it's worth it for him to continue to support someone now accused time and time and time again of preying on teenage girls as a 32-year-old man, to create a civil war in the party. At what cost, at what price do you get your civil war?
Well, it's a civil war that's already been raging, and I think, as Rick said, in a lot of ways, you've got Roy Moore leaning on the same voters who 13 months ago at this time were confronted with the Access Hollywood tape. And the Access Hollywood tape came on the heels of women stepping forward and alleging misconduct on Donald Trump's part. And Donald Trump and the folks around him saying, don't believe it. And these voters, the voters in Alabama, the Republican voters down there and across the country, 46.5% or whatever, the 46.1%, apparently didn't think it was worth turning on Trump in the presidential election. I would just put a note of caution out there, though, about this poll that shows Moore falling 12 points behind. I take this with a huge grain of salt. There are a lot of polls out there right now, and this one is way, way out of whack from that. We're not seeing all of it. It's coming from a group with a vested interest in trying to drive him out of the race. We're trying to alter the narrative. The other polls I've seen have put Roy Moore still ahead in this race. This is a state where there hasn't even been a Senate race within 10 points in 21 years. It's a state where a Democrat hasn't even come within 20 points since 2002. So I look at the average of the polls. The average of the polls still say that Roy Moore is leading this race. I think it's possible he loses. I think it's possible he collapses. I would not look at this poll that's out there right now as the bellwether.
Where did the senatorial committee ever put out a poll that so dramatically hit their own Republican candidate?
Yeah.
It's amazing.
It's intended to drive him out of the race and undermine him.
All right.